Ms. Tin Pei Ling.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, can I answer questions 3 to 20, as well as all other PQs related to the bankruptcy of the trading platform FTX together?
Please do.
Sir, before I address these questions, let me reiterate the government's and MAS's overall approach to digital assets. We have drawn a sharp distinction between growing an innovative and responsible digital asset ecosystem and speculation in cryptocurrency, which we actively discourage for the retail public. We encourage and support innovation in digital assets because we see potential for new technologies to transform cross-border payments, trade, and settlement, as well as capital market activities. Early forecasts have proven too optimistic, and it is still not clear that blockchain technology will develop beyond limited use cases into a game changer for a wide range of industries. And this is why we are piloting specific use cases to test the possibilities in the financial sector. Cryptocurrencies are a different matter. They are purely speculative as an investment asset and have no intrinsic value. That is why MAS has consistently warned the retail public not to deal with them. Members have raised two broad issues in their questions. First, on regulatory measures and the impact of the FTX bankruptcy on our financial system, and second, on the investments made by Temasek in FTX itself. Let me start with the first issue. The collapse of FTX and other major cryptocurrency platforms should bring about much-needed rationalization in the cryptocurrency space. The repercussions on the cryptocurrency ecosystem globally are still unfolding, and we are watching this. We do not have data on the number of Singapore retail users of FTX, just as for other platforms that are not licensed here and do not operate in Singapore. Unfortunately, those who invested in cryptocurrencies through FTX's global platform would have lost money. As for Singapore's broader financial system and economy, our assessment is that spillovers from the FTX collapse will be very limited. MAS's surveillance shows that key financial institutions in Singapore have insignificant exposures to cryptocurrency and crypto players. MAS has explained its approach to regulating financial institutions providing cryptocurrency services, also known as digital payment token or DPT service providers in Singapore. Such DPT service providers are regulated by MAS to address money laundering, terrorist financing, and technology risk. Whether the DPT service providers can address these risks robustly is a key consideration in licensing them to operate in Singapore. Importantly, DPT service providers are currently not regulated for safety and soundness, nor for investor protection. And this is also the prevailing approach in most jurisdictions. MAS has been consistently warning since 2017 that dealing in cryptocurrencies is hazardous, and recent events have underscored these hazards. MAS has also, in its recent statements, explained the role of MAS's Investor Alert List, or the IAL, and why FTX was not listed on it. And let me set this out again. The IAL serves a very specific purpose: to warn the public of entities that may be wrongly perceived as being regulated by MAS, especially those who solicit Singapore customers without the requisite license. MAS did not have reason to list FTX on the IAL because there was no evidence that it was soliciting users in Singapore. This is unlike Binance, which was placed on the IAL for actively soliciting users in Singapore without a valid license and is being investigated presently by CAD for possible violation of the Payment Services Act. This does not mean that all entities which are not listed on the IAL are safe to deal with. MAS cannot possibly provide an exhaustive list of all the unsafe or unlicensed entities that exist in the world. Going forward, MAS plans to introduce some basic investor protection measures for DPT service providers which are licensed in Singapore. MAS recently published a consultation paper which includes proposals that DPT service providers, amongst other things, administer a risk awareness test to evaluate if potential retail customers are suitable for accessing cryptocurrency services, segregate customers' assets from their own assets so as to prevent lending out of customers' money and protect customers' interests should the service provider fail, and refrain from operating a trading platform while simultaneously taking proprietary positions for their own account to prevent conflicts of interest. After receiving industry and public feedback, MAS will finalize the proposals and implement appropriate regulatory measures. Let me emphasize that even with these proposed measures, MAS will not be able to prevent DPT service providers from failing or customers from suffering losses. Cryptocurrency platforms can collapse due to fraud, unsustainable business models, or excessive risk-taking. FTX is not the first cryptocurrency platform to collapse, nor will it be the last. Further, even if a cryptocurrency platform is well managed, cryptocurrencies themselves, as I mentioned earlier, are highly volatile and have no intrinsic value. Those who trade in cryptocurrencies must be prepared to lose all their value. No amount of regulation can remove this risk. Next, let me address the Temasek investment in FTX and the government's stance on our investment entities and statutory boards' exposure to digital assets and cryptocurrencies. The government does not prescribe guidelines on the allocation of specific assets or asset classes, whether for cryptocurrencies or other assets. This applies to our statutory boards, as well as our three investment entities managing our whole of government assets, namely Temasek, GIC, and MAS. Statutory boards have specific mandates and functions. They are not investment entities, but they have the flexibility to invest their surpluses. And they typically do this through external fund managers under the oversight of their respective supervising boards and ministries. And we expect statutory boards to make prudent investment decisions and not be distracted from their core functions. For our investment entities, the government sets out its risk tolerance limits, monitors for appropriate diversification in asset classes, sectors, and geographies, and ensures that downside risks are not excessive. In this spirit, the government does not prescribe an exclusion list for specific assets, but we expect the entities to incorporate environmental, social, and governance, or ESG considerations into their investment processes. And they should do so in a way that best suits their investment mandates and preserves their reputation with global partners and markets. Ultimately, the government holds the boards and management teams responsible for formulating investment strategies in accordance with the government's overall risk tolerance. One of the areas Temasek and GIC's private equity arm operate in is new technology and early-stage companies. There will always be new waves of innovation and technology that seek to disrupt the status quo. Some waves will turn out to be hype and fizzle out over time. Other technologies will prove revolutionary and transformational, like the internet. But even with genuinely revolutionary technology, there are risks. Many startups will fail, while a few will prove successful and grow into industry leaders like Tencent or BioNTech. The skill of venture capitalists lies in discerning the promising projects and backing them. Risk-taking is an essential part of such investments. As long-term investors, our investment entities have to operate in the space. They do their best due diligence based on the information available. Having made the investments, they monitor the investee companies closely, but no amount of due diligence and monitoring can eliminate the risk altogether. Insofar as blockchain technology is concerned, Temasek and GIC have some investments in the digital asset space. but they have no direct exposure to cryptocurrencies. It is disappointing when there is a loss by our investment entities, as in the case of Temasek's investment in FTX. Even more so because the loss arose from what turned out to be a very badly managed company and from possible fraud and mishandling of customer funds. The fact that other leading global institutional investors like BlackRock and Sequoia Capital also invested in FTX does not mitigate this. What happened with FTX, therefore, has not only caused financial loss to Temasek, but also reputational damage. Temasek recognizes this and has issued a comprehensive statement to explain its due diligence process and the circumstances leading to its investment in FTX. Temasek has also initiated an internal review by an independent team to study and improve its processes and to draw lessons for the future. I am confident that the Temasek board and management team will learn and improve from this experience. At the same time, we should see this FTX loss in the broader context of Temasek's performance in early-stage investments. After writing off the FTX investment, Temasek's early-stage portfolio, as at March this year, has generated an internal rate of return in the mid-teens over the last decade, better than industry averages. The FTX loss will also not impact the NIRC, as the NIRC is tied to the overall expected long-term returns of our investment entities and not to individual investments. Following the FTX collapse, some members have suggested implementing more guidelines and safeguards over the investments made by Temasek and GIC. That is understandable, but the governance structures in place today for Temasek and GIC are already more extensive than those of a typical company. Temasek, which is an investment holding company, is audited by commercial auditors. GIC, which manages public funds, is audited by the Auditor General. As fifth scheduled entities, both Temasek and GIC are subject to the President's oversight of their budgets and key appointments. In Parliament, if there are any questions by members about the performance of the entities, MOF will respond to them as we are doing now. There is therefore no need for additional audit requirements or parliamentary committees. Instead, we should insulate the boards from political pressures. Let them do their work, carry out their responsibilities, and fulfill their investment mandates commercially and professionally. The investment entities themselves publish their performance with respect to broad market indices. In Temasek's case, the MSCI equities indices, and in GIC's case, the reference portfolio comprising 65% global equities and 35% global bonds. These market indices and data from reputable global investment funds serve as useful reference. But ultimately, the government evaluates the entities based on their long-term performance, and their track records show that they have performed creditably even in challenging environments. Sir, in conclusion, the FTX loss is disappointing and is being taken seriously. But the occurrence of investment losses does not in itself imply that the governance system is not working. Rather, this is the nature of investment and risk-taking. What is important is that our investment entities take lessons from each failure and success and continue to take well-judged risk in order to achieve good overall returns in the long term. In this way, we can continue to add to our national reserves and provide a stable income stream to fund government programs for a long time to come.
Ms. Tin Pei Ling.
Thank you, DPM, for the comprehensive reply. Just have two questions. One is that, may I ask if FTX is the only cryptocurrency-related investment that, the three investment entities are exposed to? And secondly, despite the failings of the cryptocurrencies, blockchain-based digital infrastructure, may still prove to be useful in other aspects. And so may I ask for these investment entities whether they have been or will continue to invest in such companies, and if they have been, how have the investment performance been so far? Thank you.
Sir, I mentioned just now that both GIC and Temasek do have exposures to new technologies and early stage companies. And these investments are within the overall context of the risk parameters set out by the government. So for GIC's case, it has a broadly diversified global portfolio. Within that, it has limited exposure to early stage companies. Temasek is largely an equities investor, and within that space, it has exposure to early stage companies, but Temasek itself has put out a statement to explain that its exposure to early stage companies is about, presently, 6% of its overall portfolio. So, and for both entities, this exposure to early stage companies would include investments in digital assets, but it would be diversified to a broad range of different sectors. So to answer the question, yes, there will be other companies in the digital asset space that GIC and Temasek have invested in, but they are within these limited parameters. And so if you talk about concerns of a broader fallout, I think it will be relatively contained. But as the member has highlighted, there may be promising use cases in blockchains. It's still too early to say, but as I have mentioned in my reply, some of the earlier optimism about blockchains have proven to be too optimistic. Remember, a few months ago, there was a lot of enthusiasm. Even within this House, members were suggesting for MES to move faster. And MES was being criticized for being too slow. So that general enthusiasm, I think, has proven to be overly optimistic. Will there be specific use cases where blockchain technologies can be applied and be promising? Well, we are pursuing pilots in MES, specific in the financial sector, and the investment entities themselves, therefore, will have to do their own due diligence in analyzing each particular case that comes up and considering whether or not to invest in these projects.
Mr. Saktiandi Supat.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to thank DPM for his assurance of the limited exposure to NIRIC. DPM, I would like to ask specifically one SQ on the whole of government investment risk management capabilities. I think given global banks' exposure to digital assets and some crypto exposures, does, for example, investment entity like MES, for example, in terms of their stress test scenarios, do they actually build in the risk to cryptocurrencies and digital assets blowing up as part of their worst-case scenarios in their stress test scenarios? For example, for FIs and even for NBFIs, non-bank FIs, especially on crypto downside risk worst-case scenarios, because it's quite important, given that the systematically important institutions may have ramifications on Singaporeans in general. Thank you.
So we do take that into account in our stress test. As I mentioned just now in my reply, MES has assessed and determined that for the financial sector itself, financial institutions based here in Singapore, our exposure to cryptocurrencies and the digital assets is very limited. But we still apply these stress tests, not just to Singapore's institutions, but to the broader global operating environment to determine how this will impact on Singapore's financial institutions. And this is part of our continued risk monitoring, not only for MAS and the financial sector, but also for the government's overall investment portfolio.
Mr. Jarogiam.
Thank you, DPM. I have two supplementary questions. Where are the risk tolerance levels spelled out to Temasek GIC and MAS? Are they published anywhere? And under current statutes and regulations, are Temasek, GIC, and MAS free to invest in anything they want to as long as their own boards or management teams approve them and they fall within the risk tolerance level? That's my first question. And secondly, does the president have any say in the setting of investment parameters, mandates, objectives, or risk tolerance levels of the investments by Temasek, GIC, and MAS? Thank you.
So I think it's important to understand the system that we have. The key to any successful long-term reserve management systems are governance, professional management, and a long-term horizon. In our case, we have put in place a very strong governance process and system where the government is the shareholder. We do not micromanage, we do not decide on investments, we do not prescribe asset classes or assets, but we have a role in appointing board members, senior management, and we hold them accountable to delivering good long-term performance. And the president is part of this governance process too, because she has in terms of the appointments of people, has the powers as well. So within that governance system that we have in place, there are processes, there are risk metrics to monitor, there are clear accountabilities, and it is a system that has worked well over the decades and has delivered good long-term outcomes for Singapore.
Mr. Leon Pereira.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Just a few questions to the DPM. Firstly, if I heard the DPM correctly in his earlier statement, he said that the government, with respect to the sovereign wealth funds, the government is not prescriptive, it does not prescribe assets and asset classes. But he also said that the government monitors the portfolios, if I heard him correctly, for geographic diversification and downside risk. So I'm just a little curious how those two things are reconciled. I mean, what kind of discussion would the government have if it monitors those risks and diversification and feels that they are off? Does the government actually intervene, and wouldn't that then be prescriptive if such a situation arose? So I just was hoping the DPM could expand on that. That's my first SQ. My second SQ is really on the rotational audit by the Auditor General's office. So I thank the DPM for confirming that GIC is subject to the AGO audits, but Temasek is not. So I'd just like to ask why that is the case, since they are both managing public funds. It could be urged that Temasek has the legal form of a private company, but against that, I would say that right now the AGO does audit ministries and statutory boards that own private companies, for example, MOH Holdings or EDB Investments, and presumably those companies under a stat board are also subject to rotational audit by the Auditor General. So the fact that Temasek, the private entity, should not in and of itself mean that it does not need to be subject to rotational audits by the Auditor General's office. That's my second. My last SQ is really, would the...
You can just keep to two SQs for now, please. Thank you.
Okay.
So I should, before answering Mr. Leon Pereira, I forgot to reply to Mr. Gerald Giam's question on the publication of the risk limits. These are published in the following sense. For example, the risk tolerance, the amount of risk that the government has set out for GIC is expressed in our reference portfolio, 65-35. That sets out the kinds of risks that the government is prepared for GIC to take, and therefore GIC as an active manager publishes its performance with regard to that risk and the performance that it tracks with regard to the reference portfolio. Likewise, in Temasek's case, it's different. It's not a portfolio manager. It's largely an all-equities investor. But in its annual Temasek review, Temasek will put out some of its risk considerations and its risk parameters. So to the extent that these risks are disclosed, the investment entities do have disclosures in their through their respective platforms, largely through their annual reports. On Mr. Pereira's question on how do you square the monitoring of assets, of geographies and all that with a policy of leaving the boards to make their own decisions. Well, we do it because monitoring is not prescribing. We monitor the portfolios. We get data, we get information, we monitor them, we subject these portfolios to stress test, given something that collapses in the an extraneous event that takes place, a crisis, fallout in cryptocurrencies. We subject to rigorous stress tests to make sure that the overall portfolio, even under these stress tests, does not have significant losses beyond a threshold that we think would be too much. So we monitor, and if indeed the stress test shows that there are too much risk being taken or concentration of a particular assets that may lead to some vulnerabilities, then we provide a feedback to the entities, and they have the discretion then to take the necessary actions to adjust. So that's how we operate, not by prescribing, but monitoring and setting in place an overall risk parameters from which our entities operate. On audit, it is not unusual at all for private auditors to audit even public agencies. Statutory boards themselves are subject to commercial auditors, private auditors, not to the Auditor General. So unless we are suggesting that somehow these private auditors are not as good as the Auditor General, I don't see any reason why. So it's not unusual that the Auditor General has a remit largely within the public service, government ministries, but for some stat boards, for a commercial entity like Temasek, which also within it has a portfolio of listed entities, well, I think we should let commercial auditors do their job, and so far they have been doing a very good job.
Mr. Edward Shah.
Thank you, Speaker. I'd like to ask DPM, because based on the recent reports on the FTX collapse, there seems to be suggest that there are weak governance controls on the moving of customers' funds, because there really isn't any obligation to put funds into trust accounts in banks for safeguarding, because digital assets are mainly on chain and not in the vault. Note DPM mentioned that there is now a consultation on reviews of regulatory approaches. So I would like to ask, is actually MES looking into regulating digital assets custody to mandate Web3 companies to put customers' digital assets into licensed custodians that perhaps use multi-party computation wallets to manage these funds and would need the asset owner's approval before the moving of such funds? This could help to reduce the risk of misusage of digital assets. Thank you.
So as I mentioned in my reply, there is an ongoing consultation process. Part of the proposals covers some of the things that the members talked about. MES is looking to segregate customers' assets from the company's own assets so that there is a very strict prohibition from lending out of customers' money, which is what happened in the case of FTX. MES is also looking at, one of the proposals is to ensure that the DPT service provider does not operate a separate trading platform that simultaneously takes proprietary positions. So these are some of the considerations, but we will finalize these proposals after the consultation. There may be more feedback, including suggestions from the members, which MES will study. But as I said also in my reply, no amount of regulation can eliminate all the risk. And even if a platform is well run, well managed, the cryptocurrency itself has no intrinsic value. It can go all the way to zero, and people who want to trade in that must be prepared to lose all their money.
Mr. Leong Mang-Wai.
Sir, I agree with the DPM that we should leave the fund managers of our sovereign funds to run the funds independently. However, because the reserves are the money of the people, accountability is important, and especially in a case like FTX, there are many unanswered questions. So I have two questions for the DPM. One is, the DPM has answered that the investment guidelines are available, okay, in separate places, like in the report of Temasek and in some places for GIC. These are things that Singaporeans like to know. So will the DPM in the future ask as government prepare all these guidelines in a consolidated place so that Singaporeans know the investment strategy and the guidelines guiding the investment of our sovereign fund? Secondly, in relation to the FTX case, has the MOF actually under the current governance structure received any reports from the Temasek? This is my first question. Okay, then.
Mr. Leong, 2 questions for now. Thank you.
Okay, then whether that report will be made available in a future session in Parliament. Thank you.
I am counting.
Thank you, sir. I will answer all 3 questions and indulge Mr. Leong. The first, whether we might consolidate all the information, well, there are just 3 entities, actually more like 2, because MAS is quite unique. It's a central bank. Its investments are really in very conservative instruments. So really, there are just all of 2 entities. There's not much to consolidate if you think about it. Go to the GIC website, go to the Temasek website. All of the information are there. And if members think useful, MOF can put up links on our website to both websites so that you can refer to them at your own pleasure and your own time. On the second question, what was the second question? Report. Yes, Temasek has provided an update to MOF on its findings. These were subsequently published by Temasek itself. That's why Temasek, as I mentioned just now, undertook it's very unusual, first of all, for Temasek or GIC for that matter, to comment on individual investments. They do not as a normal practice, because we shouldn't get into the habits of looking at individual investments in retrospect. There will always be ups and downs, and there will always be successes and failures in investments. So as a matter of practice, GIC and Temasek, in fact, do not put out any information on specific individual investments. But in this case, precisely because of the circumstances leading up to it, because from Temasek's point of view, it recognized that it has incurred reputational damage. Temasek decided to put out a statement disclosing the circumstances leading up to its investment decision, why it had done all the due diligence, and despite the due diligence found reasons to still proceed with the investment. All of that is on the Temasek website, including a series of FAQs. So all of that is available on the Temasek website. Third question is on... yeah, I've answered that too. Yeah.
Mr. Liang Eng-Hua.
Thank you, sir. The DPM, in this reply, talked about the over-optimism in the earlier stages of the crypto developments. And we also know that many financial centers like Dubai and Hong Kong are all aspiring to be the cryptocurrency hub. So we want to ask the DPM whether does the government see hubbing the cryptocurrency trading activities in Singapore as necessary to strengthen our position as a financial center? And really, what are the possible economic use cases here?
So we are not planning to hub crypto activities here. We have always looked at how we can be a responsible and innovative digital asset player. And the focus is on responsible and innovative. Where innovation is concerned, as I mentioned just now, some of the earlier optimism about blockchain technologies has been proven to be a little bit too optimistic, not well placed, and I think there's now a more realistic sense of what these technologies can do. We are now continuing with pilot projects on payments, on capital markets, on settlements, to work out what are the promising use cases for such technologies. That we will continue to do. And within that context, there may be a role for DPT service providers. But if these DPT service providers do exist in Singapore, are licensed here, and DPT service providers would include exchanges for token payments, for cryptocurrencies and tokens, then they will be licensed. And as I have highlighted, MAS has published, even before the FTX collapse, a series of consultation papers with tighter regulatory measures. And after our consultations, we will want to put in place these tightened measures for the licensed entities.
Mr. Leon Pereira.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I just have one supplementary question to really question the DPM on his reply to my earlier SQ. So it's just one, you can count me on that. Of course, ministries' statutory boards are subject to commercial external auditors, and that includes the private companies under them. And GIC is also subject to commercial external auditors, as is Temasek. But ministries, stat boards, GIC, and the private companies under ministries and stat boards are also subject, on top of that, to the Auditor General's audit. So why is it then that Temasek is not subject to the Auditor General's audit? Thank you.
Sir, not all stat boards are subject to the Auditor General's audit. But in fact, where there are issues that come up, it could be in a town council, it could be in a stat board, it could be in Temasek. If there are reasons, we will have no hesitation to ask the Auditor General to go in to do a full audit.
Mr. Leong Mawai. Sorry. Ms. Hazel Phua, wrong arm.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I had filed two parliamentary questions on how government manages these two investment entities, GIC and Temasek, but I don't believe they have been answered in the minister's answer earlier. And that was, firstly, when there are huge investment losses, does MOF demand internal and external investigations just to make sure that there are no evidence of negligence or misconduct? And the second question was that does MOF actually benchmark the performance of Temasek Holding and GIC against other comparable funds like other sovereign wealth funds? And if so, which funds are these and how do they compare? Thank you.
Sir, I did mention briefly in my reply just now that when it comes to performance management, we do assess and monitor closely the long-term performance of our investment entities. The published references are the GIC reference portfolio, as well as the MSCI equities indices, which are published by both Temasek and GIC respectively. And if you look at both entities' performance vis-a-vis these reference points, they have done well. In fact, it's all published information. They have done well over the long term. We also track the performance of other fund managers. That's more internal. But in fact, many of these fund managers' performances are published. Anyone can look at how private equities has done, top quintile, top quartile, asset managers, how they have done over the long term. That information is published. So anyone can look at that data and compare that with GIC and Temasek's performance, which is also published. And the facts remain that even after comparing GIC and Temasek with other leading institutional investors, our two investment entities have done well, creditably, amidst very difficult challenge, a more challenging investment environment. So on that basis, so that's for performance management. On losses, whether or not we require specific audits or reviews to be done, losses happen all the time as part of the investment process. So you have to really take that into consideration and look at the overall portfolio rather than look at each individual project that doesn't do well. And as I mentioned just now, if you look at the overall portfolio for both Temasek and GIC, their performance has been creditable and, in fact, in many instances, above industry averages. But in this case, because it's such an exceptional situation, there was gotten so much publicity, it has also impacted Temasek reputationally. Temasek itself has undertaken its review, it's put out information, and it has taken the extra step of doing a further review, which it has also said it will do, an internal review led by an independent team, reporting to the board, and with the purpose of looking at how it can learn from this experience and improve its own processes.
Ms. Hertingru.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have two supplementary questions. First, is the Minister shared that licensed DPT service providers are required to put in place a risk assessment test, among other things. However, had such measures actually been put in place, unlicensed service providers such as FTX could still have conducted business activities in Singapore with our retail customers. How does the government intend to address this gap? And my second question is, I note that Temasek's investment in FTX at US dollars 275 million was a small percentage of their overall portfolio. However, given the concerns around the viability of blockchain and crypto-related industries, will the Minister be willing to share what is the number of companies, dollar value, and percentage exposure to service providers and technology infrastructure players related to blockchain and the digital asset space to assure Singaporeans, especially when the Straits Times reported on 24th November that GIC is an investor in the group with ties to troubled cryptocurrency broker Genesis Trading? Thank you.
So on the first question, the gap in regulations will exist no matter what we do. And even if we have a very comprehensive system in Singapore, it does not stop Singaporeans from going overseas or going online to overseas platforms to invest in cryptocurrency. So this is not going to stop that from happening. I think what we should do is focus on what are reasonable regulations, learning from the recent experiences, and put in place a sound regulatory system, but at the same time, continue with the reminders and public education we have been doing all this while for so many years, and we will step up our efforts there to let people know the risk of investing in cryptocurrency, that this is highly volatile, it has no intrinsic value, and really anyone who does this has to go in with their eyes open. On the second question, I've already actually answered that in the context of Ms. Tin Pei Ling's first question, or first supplementary question, setting out the investments that our investment entities make in this digital asset space within the context of their holdings in early stage companies. We don't go beyond that because we do not go into specific company investments, but within that broad context and the parameters I've set out, I hope members are assured that the exposures are limited and it's within the context of a very well diversified portfolio, which will then allow us to still earn good returns on other projects, even though there may well be a few projects where there are losses. But that's a whole point of diversification in investments.
This is Zulkarnain Rahim.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. DPM, thank you for the clarifications. I do appreciate and understand that losses are part and parcel of the investment landscape. I don't think anyone questions when Temasek makes money. And it's not an easy job. But there are two fallouts to this particular collapse of the FTX. One is on the retail investors as well. There are scammers, opportunists taking advantage of the situation, setting up websites for people to come forward to make claims. Would the MAS be looking into how to protect our Singaporean retail investors in this regard? Secondly, DPM talked about reputational damage to Temasek, especially given the fraud allegations in the particular collapse. Would, even with the write-off, would Temasek be looking to reserving its rights to claim, to make any particular claim should the need arise? Thank you.
Yes, to the second question, I'm sure Temasek is on top of this and will reserve its rights to do so. On the first question, there are scammers. We are concerned about that, whether it's in the crypto space, whether it's SMS, whole range of different scams. That's why we have set up a task force specifically on scams, and we will do whatever we can to address this problem.
Mr. Pritam Singh.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, DPM. Just following up on DPM's replies to some of the supplementary questions. With regard to the Temasek's independent review of the FTX imbroglio, this independent review, is it an external one that reports external to Temasek, or is it internal Temasek, a Temasek team reporting on Temasek's investment in FTX? The second question is, what thresholds must be crossed before the AGO steps in to audit a Temasek investment or Temasek investment process in a company? Thank you.
So this Temasek review that has initiated is an internal one. It will be led by people who are separate from the investment team that made this decision. So they will be separate, they will not be clouded by what steps were taken, and they will report directly to the board, as I mentioned just now. What further actions might MOF as shareholder or government take in order, is this sufficient in this case, or what thresholds would be reached in order for us to trigger further action? Quite aside from this case, for which Temasek is doing its part and is pursuing this review, which I would add separately that it does this for FTX, but it actually also does this, it has done this in the past before, when there are similar instances. It doesn't happen very often, but when there are instances where, for example, there's a write-off in an investment project where there is a permanent impairment and it's an investment that didn't go well, then they would initiate something like this. And they have done this before, and that's what they are doing again. It's a step up from their usual review process, which applies to all investments. But in this case, as has happened in the past, Temasek feels that this is a significant project and there is something to be learned from the experience, so they are undertaking this separate review. Will we go beyond such a separate review to call in external auditors, for example? I think is the question that the leader of the opposition raised. Certainly, the government will not rule out doing so, but it will then have to be it's not just a matter of an investment loss, but it will be something that we feel has gone wrong within the organization, possibly. There might be negligence, there might be fraud, there might be misconduct. So it has to be of that significant threshold for us to say, look, something is not right within the organization. Let us commission or get the Auditor General to go in and do a proper audit and investigation. And we will not rule out if something like that were to happen.
Dr. Tan Wu Ming.
I thank DPM for his comprehensive answers. Sometimes in these situations, the mood among investors and investment-related decision makers can change as the narrative shifts. Can I ask whether DPM foresees the possibility that investors and investment entities will shy away and have a chilling effect on their appetite for high potential, long-term investments that nevertheless have good fundamentals? Because in the science and technology sector, there have been investments and developments with a long horizon that bore fruit many years later, whether it was the vaccines that allowed us to fight COVID, whether it is monoclonal antibodies that took years to become viable treatments for diseases, and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That is precisely the advantage that we have as investors. It's a very important strategic advantage that GIC and Temasek has, to have that long-term perspective and not just to focus on the short term or follow and chase after fads. And then if the market cycle comes down, you quickly sell your assets. and sell your loss and then to cut your losses. That's not something we want to do. We want our entities to have that long-term horizon, invest within the risk limits, invest in some new technologies, some early-stage companies, recognizing that, as I said just now, many startups will not do well, but a few might eventually prove to be wildly successful and become giants in their own right. So there is a place for that, and our investment entities do recognize this, and there is an appropriate allocation in their portfolios for such investments. And they will continue to take such risk. But I hope everyone in this House recognizes this. And that's why it's important we insulate our investment entities from these political pressures and let them do their jobs well, commercially and professionally, as they have been doing all these years.